Hello, in August I shared the initial progress of the character controller for my third-person Souls-like. It got a ton of really kind comments and very helpful feedback, so I just wanted to thank everyone who watched, commented, liked or subscribed. In this video, I'll go over all the feedback and suggestions that you all gave and try to implement them or at least address them. Game developers can get too familiar with what they're making, and as a result, everything feels natural and smooth to them, when in reality it may not feel that great. That's why I really do believe getting outside perspective is beneficial and to get feedback from their target audience so that the best possible game is made. We'll start with movement and animation. Feedback in this area was the most commonly given and there was a lot of insightful comments, but this one was the harshest but the most helpful. Max Randell described how they felt about the movement on the ground and in the air, gave advice on preserving momentum, informed me of a bug, and then ending their comment with a pretty funny comparison. Of course, game developers shouldn't just accept every piece of advice they get. Sometimes players or other people don't get the full picture. It's up to the developer to have discretion and awareness about their game and vision. But here, I very much agree with everything that Max says. So first, let's fix the bug where pressing the sprint/dodge button at any time mid-air makes you dodge once you land on the ground. This makes movement uncontrollable and can make you dodge off a platform without meaning to. This is actually an intended feature, but I was more going for giving the player some margin of error. In Sekiro, if you jump and press the dodge button a split second before you land on the ground, the game recognizes that you want to dodge as soon as possible and lets you do that. I wanted to do the same thing, but my initial implementation, I will admit, didn't really include any of the timings. So what I did was rework my jump component to emit a signal the moment the character lands on the ground. In my dodge component, I now made it so that whenever the player intends to dodge, this is true when the button is pressed, I save what time it is in that moment. I then connected the just landed signal from my jump component to a function in my dodge component. After getting the time in which the player lands on the ground, I can then get the time elapsed between pressing the dodge button and landing on the ground. If that elapsed time is bigger than the margin I set, I prevent them from dodging. Now the player only dodges if they press the dodge button a split second before touching the ground. Next, we'll go over how the movement feels. Max says that it is too slow and stiff on the ground. Actually, a person on the Godot Discord said the same thing in their feedback. What I realized was that games don't really have walking as their base speed. Elden Ring and Sekiro have more of a light jog as their default movement speed. So, I found jog animations on Mixamo and swapped those in instead of the walk animations. The strafe jog didn't fit too well, so I'm keeping the strafe walk as a placeholder until I get better ones. So hopefully that helps with it being slow and stiff on the ground. For it being loose and sliding in the air, I reduced the amount of movement you can do to change your initial momentum when you jump. You still have some control, but it's not as sensitive. I also made the character keep facing forward even when you want to move back, like in Sekiro, which minimizes that slippery feeling when you see the character just spinning around all over the place. I also made the jump animation fade out right when you land, so the player doesn't just slide on the ground for a moment without moving their feet. Max talked about sprinting screwing up movement in general, and there's probably a few things I could do to iron it out a bit more, but I think one major contributing factor to this sentiment is the initial dash that the player does when you do press sprint. Even Taika in their feedback brought up how the character starts moving while standing and pressing sprint. It feels weird right now because there's no communication to the player that you're actually dashing or dodging. I think some particles and a ghosting effect will make this problem go away, but of course, I'll do it in the future. Maybe I'll also add an animation to supplement the mechanic. Actually, another thing to consider is adding the ability for the player to change keybinds. This would allow sprint and dodge to be on different keys if that's what the player wants, but it's not a priority right now. So I think I've addressed most if not all of Max's comment. Their feedback was extremely helpful. Constructive criticism like this is what will help me in making an actually decent game. Going back to Taika from the Godot Discord, another really helpful person that took the time to play my demo and then write out this really valuable feedback. Hopefully I fixed the base walk speed from Max's comment earlier. They talked about the transitions between standing still, walking, running to be unnatural, but I feel like they're fine. so I didn't really mess with it here, but of course this decision isn't set in stone. They also talked about the attack animation looking weird and how the player lifts their shoulders at the end, and I definitely agree with that. Speaking of the attack animations looking weird, a person from my university's game dev club pointed out that the head turns with the body when attacking, but they should be looking forwards. I tried fiddling around with the blend filtering, but I wasn't able to isolate the head movement. A lot of my problems are going to be the animations, but honestly, I tried getting into character modeling and animating in Blender and I didn't enjoy it. I realized that I like the coding and game design aspects a whole lot more. This means that I do plan on hiring an animator when I eventually get out of the prototyping stage. Okay, back to Taika. They felt the camera was unresponsive, so I slightly increased the speed at which the camera spins around with the player. The camera not turning when you walk into it is intended, I guess. It doesn't occur in Sekiro or Elden Ring, so I'm leaving it out for now. This does seem helpful, but I'll only add it in later once I notice that the player would actually benefit from this. And I addressed the character moving when pressing sprint earlier. That's all for Taika's feedback. Thanks again for the support, and sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. This comment from Reddit says to move the character forwards when attacking. The thing is, what they're suggesting is already happening, but I guess it's just not really that noticeable. The second person talked about preparation and recovery to make the attack look better. They also mentioned animations, but as I said before, not really my strong suit, so I'm putting it off for now. So hopefully you can see here I delayed the movement, increased how much you move, and adjusted how the legs looked. It still doesn't look perfect, but I really like the improvement so far. Moving on from attacking, this wasn't in any of the feedback I received, but I noticed that if the player falls for longer than the jump animation, it would look like they're standing upright while falling. And if the player walks or runs off of a platform, they continue to walk or run while in the air. So I got a falling idle animation from Mixamo and hooked it in. Now the jump animation transitions into the falling idle if the player is in the air but isn't about to land. I can check if the player isn't about to land by having a raycast point down and notice if the player's Y velocity is negative. Okay, this is a bit of a tangent, but here's a tip for Godot developers using blend trees. If you want to seamlessly transition between two animations, use a blend 2 node instead of a transition node with 2 states. Of course, you'll still have the 2 states, the 2 different animations, but instead you'll transition between them using code, using lerps to lerp between 1 and 0 and vice versa based on a variable. So what that means is, yeah, it'll just transition like that in code. But it also means if you're in the middle of a transition and you want to go back, it will do, like, the linear interpolation handles it really well. What I found with the transition, now I don't know if this is exactly how it works, but if you're in the middle of a transition and you want to go back instead of smoothly going back, so you're in the middle, I feel like it goes all the way to one end and then assumes, it assumes you're at this end already, so it keeps you there and then it transitions back. So there's kind of like an instantaneous jarring transition, not really a transition, like, instant change, and then it does a transition, which isn't really the behavior that I'm looking for. So if you want to do seamless transitions, use a blend 2, but for like abstract states like locked on or not locked on, or different the different attacks, I feel like the transitions did fine. But to be fair, if there was a blend node that could have multiple inputs, I would be using that blend node. Okay, next piece of feedback. This person mentioned that Mixamo animations are root motion. Root motion is when you use the actual animation movement to move the character, instead of just keeping them in place while they do the animation and then using code to move them around. I've heard that root motion looks better and makes animations more internally consistent, but since this transfers the development of movement from code to animation, and again, I'm a coder, I'd much rather focus on my strengths. Okay, I've been bashing animations this entire video, and I promise that's the last of it, but there's one more thing that is animation adjacent. This person suggested using inverse kinematics. IK is a technique used to set the motion of jointed parts like arms or legs by specifying how the ends, like hands or feet, are positioned and letting the system determine the appropriate angles and positions of the joints. This kind of goes the opposite way to root motion, where the animation is now dictated by code. It really is tempting to give this a go, but I ultimately made the decision to not pursue this because it will be such a complex task and I'm just looking for quick development right now. However, I do want to explore the use of inverse kinematics. Maybe I'll have the cliche procedural movement spider enemy. Alexa suggests to consider a hierarchical finite state machine to handle the various states of the player. This may be a hot take, I don't know, but the thing is, I don't really get state machines. I've had a look again at state machines, the state pattern, and now learning about hierarchical finite state machines. And for some reason I just don't like how it all works. It's why I don't even use state machines in my animations. Maybe I don't understand it well enough, and that I'm making a big mistake not implementing it early on, but I guess we'll see. When I eventually have to deal with more states, such as different abilities, I guess we'll revisit this topic. I'll probably realize then why I should have used them in the first place, but for now I'm going to be stubborn and continue with my setup. Moving on to a couple of comments regarding the orbit movement that happens when you're locked on and moving left or right. My implementation of this wasn't perfect. At certain distances you would go towards the target or move away from them. This comment suggests to create a circle around the target given the distance from the player, and then to move the player along this curve. This seems like a pretty simple fix, but further thinking about it, it would seem difficult to create the curve with complex environments. And since I'm using velocity to move my player, I can't just change their position along the curve. And also, I don't know how I would retrieve a velocity vector that would correctly make the player follow the curve. To me, it doesn't seem like the right approach, but I do apologize if I'm just too stupid to understand how to do this. This person provided an implementation of the orbit using Unity code, but the thing is, I'm pretty sure I'm doing exactly what they're doing. They're applying a rotation to the original move direction, so that the player is essentially moving as if the target is always in front of them. Therefore, moving left and right should just be moving around them in a circle. My code does exactly this though, but for some reason it turns into a spiral. I've added this bit on the end to try and alleviate the problem. It's a very weird bug, but I don't really want to spend that much more time on this unless it really messes with the combat, which I won't find out if I never get to developing the combat. Okay, I said I didn't want to spend more time on it, but I spent more time on it. And I think I found out what the problem was, but I don't really have a good solution for it. So essentially, we know that I rotate this move direction with a target look angle, and this is my to alleviate the death spiral, you have to call it, but move direction, it's a variable. I retrieve this variable in my movement component, but the kicker is I lerp my desired velocity to this move direction, and it's got a pretty low weight. So this means I calculate a trajectory to orbit perfectly around this target called the move direction. But since I'm lerping, I'll always be lagging behind. I won't have that perfect trajectory to orbit the target. So that's why I've been spiraling. The reason I lerp is just to make the movement smoother. So it's not just like, to make the movement smoother. That's why I don't really know a good fix for it without putting in a bunch of conditionals and stuff like that. But I played around with this value a bit more, and I've settled on 0.13 for now, because at a certain point, if I'm too close, I move away. If I'm too far, I move towards. But there's this the space where it's like the Goldilocks zone or whatever, where I've made it so it's kind of close enough where I could hit the target if I wanted to. That's what I kind of did. So yeah, and it shouldn't be too bad if the player moves towards the target, right? It's not too bad. It's fine. It's fine. Yeah, let me know your thoughts. But okay, I'm done. I'm done with orbiting. Moving on. Okay, actually, one more thing I wanted to talk about. It's not to do with orbiting, but the whole situation actually made me solve a problem with my lock-on system. And so essentially, I do a raycast check if I want to lock onto something. Is there a wall in between? Is there a wall between the lock-on component that I want to lock onto? If there is, do not lock onto it. For example, there's an enemy behind here. I want to lock onto it, but between the camera and the lock-on component is a wall. I'm pressing lock on and it's not doing anything. And it was a problem because what if I wanted to put lock-on components inside the environment? It would hit the wall and it won't let me lock on. And I had a fix for this where I just put the lock-on component a bit hovered outside the wall. But as you can see, I managed to fix this. This lock-on component is nicely inside this pillar. And I did this by putting a export variable in a lock-on component, and so I can specify that which collider or which node this lock-on component is inside. So it's this box. This lock-on component I said is inside this box. And so in my lock-on system, in the code where I check if I can see see the lock-on component, if there's a wall in front of the the lock-on component, I do a check. If the collider isn't the one that I specified, then yeah, I won't be able to see it. But if it is, just it says that I can see the lock-on component. So here, since I set it up that it's inside this, I can lock onto it. Same with this. But hopefully this works. I can't, it's too far. Okay, yeah, there we go. I can lock onto here. I can't lock on to it here because this wall is invalid. So yeah, that's it for this. I'm happy with it. A bit more flexibility, and yeah, it just works a bit better. I had a couple comments regarding making the player fade out when the camera gets too close. I showed off my failed attempt in the previous devlog where I tried to use a viewport to render the player. I would fade out the viewport texture when the camera gets too close, but this meant the shadows don't get cast on the player. Max Randell says to just use the transparency shader on the player's mesh, but this is actually what I did before doing the viewport method. The problem was that Godot doesn't allow transparent objects to cast shadows, and also the sorting of the meshes gets screwed up, so even if it was fully opaque, no shadows are cast, and it just looks pretty bad with the mesh sorting. This is an inherent limitation with the engine and is expected behavior at this point. It sucks because the fading is so easy to do and it looks really good. There were other options I fiddled around with such as alpha scissor and alpha hash, but alpha scissor just creates a distinct toggle instead of a fade, and alpha hash creates a weird looking fade as it randomly takes out pixels from being rendered. Joseph here said something about dithering as a solution to make the player fade, but I basically know nothing about shaders, so even this seemingly simple technique intimidated me and I didn't bother to explore further. I realize that sounds really pitiful, but I do plan on sitting down and learning shaders in Godot. I feel like once I get shaders and especially particles under my belt, I'll be ready to really take this project off the ground. After failing on the straightforward method and then getting intimidated by the dithering technique, I was ready to move on and to just not have the player fade out. But I did one last Hail Mary Google search and it led me to this Reddit post by Interference22. And it was the most random yet absolutely perfect find because it's a transparency shader that I can just put on the mesh that literally uses the dithering technique. The code makes no sense to me right now, but when I implemented it, it was exactly what I was looking for. The dithering looks decent and the player casts shadows normally. You don't cast a shadow when you're fully transparent, unlike in Sekiro, but I'll definitely take it. Hopefully when I learn more about shaders, I'll be able to tweak and modify it, but for now I'm happy with what I've got. So I guess that's the fading dealt with. Maybe the next things to consider is other entities or objects fading as well when the camera gets blocked, but I just want to move on. Going back to Joseph for the moment, before they talked about dithering, they suggested the use of a buffered input system. It's basically a technique where you temporarily store the player's input to execute them at the appropriate time. I'm pretty sure all From Software games have a buffered input system, and I actually implemented a very primitive version of this earlier in the video. We had the problem of pressing sprint anytime in air, making you dodge as soon as you hit the ground. This essentially meant that you had a really big input buffer. My fix just made that buffer smaller so that it'll only register when you press dodge a split second before touching the ground. A buffered input system is a good idea, but I'll hold off on implementing it for now, as I'd rather build it up with the combat system so that everything fits together nicely. One thing that I'll make sure to do is to really playtest my input buffer timings. Some people have complained with the long buffers with Elden Ring, and I initially found this difficult with Sekiro as well. But maybe this may be part of the experience, to be deliberate with your actions, and a bigger buffer may be a way to teach that to the player. We'll see how it goes when I actually get to implementing this. Jacob here talks about addressing potential coupling by doing a refactor and designing the code from the top down. High coupling is what we're trying to avoid, and is when components are too dependent on each other, and so it reduces the ability to modify them without affecting other components or be able to use them individually. Their advice is really helpful, but this is my first time creating a game like this, and especially in Godot, so I basically have no clue what a good design even looks like for a game system or what a bad system is. Of course, I could take in what I know from regular software development, but even that I still need to work on a bit more. So I think for now I'm going to continue building things up as I go, doing small refactors here and there, and just learning as much as possible on the beneficial principles and also the pitfalls to avoid. Hopefully I won't have to do a massive refactor in the future, but I'll learn to design effective systems. Thanks Jacob for the insight, especially with the thought process you suggested on designing and improving systems. Raw Carrot 1, I probably butchered that, but they suggested some sort of file transfer protocol so that I can make prototyping with my Steam Deck more streamlined. Beforehand, I just passed a micro SD card between my computer and Steam Deck. It was tedious. I actually made a program that provides selective sync for Dropbox on Linux. It's very basic and pretty buggy, but I actually find it very useful. So I set it up on my Steam Deck, and all I have to do now is create a build, sync from my computer, then on my Steam Deck I press sync on the folder to download it, set permissions, and I actually initially set up the game's path on Steam, then I can press play. Now I don't have to fumble around with a micro SD card. They also talked about using my Steam Deck as a virtual controller. I don't have Steam on my PC. This probably sounds dumb, but I don't really want to download Steam. It's kind of like a productivity only type of thing, even though this purpose would be for productivity. I just kind of don't want to deal with Steam being on my computer. I realize now that I will need Steam if I ever want to put up a game on it, but that's still very far away. And yeah, then I'll download it. After trying this new workflow out, I've realized that it's still not as efficient as it could be, and it's still a tad bit tedious. But there is actually the ability to use the Steam Deck as a controller in general. This guide here was pretty helpful and I managed to set it up. Unfortunately, the controls don't get properly registered compared to running it from Steam itself on the Steam Deck. What I have now with the syncing is still very much an improvement compared to the micro SD card, and after using this workflow a few times already, it's not bad. Okay, back to Godot. I choose to export the game into an executable instead of running the actual project on my Steam Deck because of the next topic. I had a couple comments talking about errors loading the main scene, but it's honestly pretty cool that people are even looking at the GitHub and let alone downloading the project. One of the commenters added me on Discord and I managed to figure out what the problem was. I use Blender imports in the project. which means I can just save the Blender files and Godot will handle importing the models, animations, etc. But if you don't have this feature configured, you'll get an error saying failed to load the main scene. Going back to my Steam Deck for a second, I export my project because I don't want to deal with any sort of configuration. I don't want to download Blender on it and configure Godot or any other things in general. I just want to hit play and check how my changes feel on a controller. So I made an issue on GitHub that explains this problem and how to solve it. And I also updated the README to link to the issue and communicate that you need Blender imports to open the project. One more thing I want to bring up is another improvement to my lock-on system. Beforehand, I had an angle that the camera would not exceed when locked onto a target. This ensured that the target would be in a nice spot on the screen wherever you moved. It worked perfectly fine for most of the usual cases, but if you wanted to lock onto a target that's below you, this restriction didn't let you do that. So I did some algebra based on the difference in Y distance from the player to the target and what I wanted the corresponding camera angle to be. So now it still looks good when you're on the same level as the target, but now you can lock onto targets below you. Okay, I think I've addressed most, if not all, of everyone's comments. Hopefully I've made the movement a bit better, especially the mid-air movement. It's not as sensitive, but it is. You should still have some control while in the air. I've also worked on the attacking, making the movement more pronounced, and then changing the animations to accommodate that. Also, can't believe I got the player fading to work. Really happy with that. Looks really good, works with the shadows, absolutely amazing. Thanks for the comments on that, and especially that god-saving Reddit post with the exact code. Hopefully I'll be able to understand it soon, and shaders in general. But yeah, really happy with that. I've uploaded a new demo on GitHub, so the link to that is down in the description below. Give it a shot. It shouldn't be that big of a change, but it should be better. If it's not better, definitely tell me. We don't want that to happen. And I think, even though I might get a lot of feedback, I'm definitely taking a break from the movement character controller because I want to work on the enemy AI a bit more. I worked on the AI for like a week or two before addressing the comments, and yeah, it was a pretty good time. Pretty basic behavior right now. It's just moving towards me and then strafing once it gets to a certain distance. So yeah, if you made it to the end of the video, I really appreciate you. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and comment down below any suggestions, ideas, feedback, criticisms, anything at all. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video or devlog. Peace.